Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Dialogues Online Philosophy Club. In this club, we discuss what makes the West work and what doesn't. Tonight, we've decided to talk about one of the most controversial topics currently in the news, and fortunately it's not COVID-19, but it is almost as bad. I'm of course talking about the Russian-Ukraine conflict, which has dominated the headlines since February of this year. Now, most of you would probably have heard the mainstream media version, and I know it's the good old catchphrase, the mainstream media. But here we're not dealing with conspiracy theories or cynical right-wing conspiracy theories, but we're thoughtfully considering the lack of balance that the Russian Federation is currently experiencing, particularly in the South African media. If you look at headlines, you see very little potential of critical analysis, and if you read further, your expectations will be fulfilled. We find that rather than to critically analyze the history of a very complex phenomenon, we normally find little more than a demonization of Vladimir Putin, a rehashing of talks about fascism, and very little consideration of what is actually going on there and why this is so important. Now, in the years 1989 to 1992, the world thought that it was experiencing some version of Oscar Wilde's utopia. The good ended happily and the bad unhappily. The Soviet Union, which Ronald Reagan famously described as the evil empire, had come to an end in a meltdown of glasnost and perestroika. Mikhail Gorbachev's terms for the much needed reforms after almost 70 years of hard-nosed communism. For many, this signified the triumph not only of the free market over the state-based capitalism, but a veritable triumph of good over evil, the final affirmation of the innate moral superiority of the United States and its Western European allies. Those who believed this tale should have paid attention to the fact that Wilde was talking about fiction and not about real life. Just a moment. Okay. It would perhaps be unfair to regard Francis Fukuyama's famous political thesis presented under the title The End of History and the Last Man as a kind of Wildean fairy tale. After all, he didn't say that important events would cease to occur, but simply that history with a capital H was over. The end of the Cold War signified the end point of mankind's ideological evolution. Fukuyama since then expressed certain reservations about the original thesis as it was stated in 1992. However, we do not think that he went far enough, and there are three major reasons for this. The first is that at the very moment the West seems to have reached a point of absolute truth, it appears to have rejected the notion of truth altogether. it appears to be caught in a particular paradox. On the one hand, it seeks to maintain the moral high ground in terms of its victory over the Soviet bloc. As mentioned before, this state of moral righteousness was perhaps personified by Ronald Reagan's designation of the Soviet Union as the evil empire. On the other hand, this very triumph is today rendered internally problematic in that truth has become a rather exclusive phenomenon. Something is a rather exclusive phenomenon. Something is either true or it's not. It excludes those who are not favored by the correspondence of facts to reality. It is hardly necessary to draw attention to the way in which obvious truths are denied today or considered irrelevant. Not only the woke, but their older cousins, the politically correct, but also leading thinkers like the oft-quoted Richard Rorty, who considers truth at best a construct, as well as the plethora of thinkers following in his wake. Now, this leads to a very distinct problem. In order to preserve the moral high ground, certain truths have to be accepted. That liberty is more important than servitude. Universally accepted legal principles like the odi alterum partem rule, here the other side is a valid point for legal proceedings, that fairness is a genuine value which ought to be accepted and defended. But if truth is but an arbitrary construct, in the name of which principle is something like arbitrary military action to be condemned. Concomitant with this is the curious situation where liberal democracy is today undermined in the very place where it once found a home, Western Europe and the United States. It is uncomfortable with the notion today that the principles in terms of which the other is liberated today was drawn up and established almost entirely by the one. In question time, we might say something more about that. This is, of course, a conversation worth having in its own right, and rest assured we'll be doing just this in the following series of talks. For now, however, it should be noted that yet another paradox is far from resolved. It concerns the following problem. Is liberal democracy still liberal or democratic if it's enforced from outside? Most people are perfectly comfortable with the history of how Napoleon's armies spread the values of the French Revolution throughout Western Europe, and they accept it as a matter of course. However, as we know on this continent especially, enforcing democracy from outside has often achieved the opposite effect. The great Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the father of what we would today call progressive history, held a position that many would today call shocking, namely the notion that every nation in the world have access to truth, but according to its own linguistic or historical framework. This, however, is much more than garden variety relativism, which holds that the solitary individual can somehow extract him or herself from the external world, regard it from a distance, and choose whatever he or she wants. This position has been rejected by thinkers ranging from Einstein to Heidegger. It is perhaps Hans-Georg Gadamer who reminded us that our own situatedness in history and linguistic communities is not an impediment to truth, but an important source of orientation towards it. All that's required is an open conversation held in good faith, and, this may seem rather surprising, a sense of trust, both in truth as a manifestation and those who endeavor to find it. The audience has probably noticed the specific reference to Napoleon's armies, and it is hopefully cottoned on that the one country which famously resisted Napoleon's march throughout Europe was Russia. Is this to say that they have no concept of liberty, or that they didn't have access to the hallowed truth which the NATO countries, today consider themselves to be the personal custodians? Or could it be argued that they are the ones who maintain a robust sense of liberty while the West is in danger of sinking into an era of decadence, relativism, and irrelevance? Could the West need Russia more than Russia the West?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On the 24th of February 2022, Russia, completely unprovoked, attacked a democratic country, starting a war. The battle is being fought on three major fronts. There's the ground war in Ukraine, there's the political front, and there's the economic front. Starting with the war in Ukraine, the Russian command has been shown their incompetence by not taking Ukraine over in 2 weeks. They also missed the second deadline on the 9th of May. The Russians lost the battle for Kiev, and the troops ran out of food, and also they ran out of fuel for their trucks. The Russian military is using old equipment, and they're running out of missiles, and the Ukrainians have downed so many planes that Putin's great parade on the 9th of May didn't even have a single plane. All the money that Russia spent on the military after 2014 was stolen by corruption, and we have seen very little military improvement in Russia. According to Ukrainian officials, the Russian casualties is currently at 30,850. In desperation, the Russian military shoots at civilian corridors and targets civilian infrastructure. This is the message that you've been hearing in the media for the past 3 months, but I would like to paint a completely different picture. To do that, I would like to show just a little bit of history. After the fall of the USSR, we saw the rise of a new Russia. Economically, they became open and started to become more free market. We've seen a lot of Western companies moving into Russia, but unfortunately that was not reciprocated by the West. Russian companies had a very difficult time getting into Western markets, and as a result, we saw the outflow of money out of Russia. As well, Boris Yeltsin, he was the president before Putin came, he said that a long-term political aim of him was to join NATO. Putin also shared the same sentiment and wanted to build a prosperous future with Europe. You know, also in the schooling system, you would see that Russia made a complete and utter turn from the USSR. For example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago is compulsory reading, and the Gulag Archipelago, if you don't know, is one of the major axes that brought the USSR to a fall. So this is the view that Russia had of the West. You know, we're going to build a prosperous future and everything. And then in 1999, we saw the bombing of Yugoslavia. So the previous picture, I don't know if you know, this is not Ukraine. This is Yugoslavia in 1999, when NATO, without the United Nations approval, bombed a city in the center of Europe. We hear so much about Putin starting a war in Europe that hasn't been seen for a century, but unfortunately, that's not true. So just to get back to this slide. So the bombing of Yugoslavia, they went in without the United Nations approval. There's about 500 civilians that died and about 1,000 military personnel. So the ratio is about 1 civilian for every 2 military guys, and according to the West, that's completely justified. There was hospitals that was bombed, schools that was bombed, and most famously, there was the Primakov's loop. The current Prime Minister of Russia was called Primakov. That's the guy at the bottom. He turned his plane around in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He was on his way to America, and the moment he heard that America and NATO bombed Yugoslavia, he turned his plane around and returned to Russia. And after that, you can see that Russia was a lot more hesitant of working with the West. Then in 2001, America invaded Afghanistan, and that was without the UN's approval once again. Oh, and just to get back to the NATO bombings of Yugoslavia, no one was facing war crimes. There was no one who had any accountability after that. You know, very little change. The United Nations did do a few stuff, but no one has held accountable for the death of those 500 civilians. The same in Afghanistan, and the same in Iraq and Syria and Libya and all the other countries as well. So the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan was completely illegal. And as it turns out, you know, the people who committed 9/11 was all Saudi citizens. So why would you invade Afghanistan? In 2003, America with its allies, the UK, Poland, and Australia, invaded Iraq, once again without the United Nations approval, because there were weapons of mass destruction, which a UN inspections team said there was not, right before, I think it was, who was it? Never mind. The president at that time knew about it, and they still decided to invade Iraq. Bush, sorry, yeah. He recently said that in a Freudian slip, which is a very interesting video to watch. So in 2007, Putin decided that, you know, he saw what the West really is. You know, they stand for justice, they stand for democracy, but in their actions, they're completely against that. You know, there is no justice, there is no truth, you know, there is no, you know, freedom for people except outside the West. Inside the West, yeah. So he gave his famous Munich speech. Right in front of everyone at the Munich Security Council, Putin talked right to their faces and told them that he's not going to agree with them. He talked about the unipolar world and that America cannot be the dictator of the world. He talked about the indivisibility of security, that one person cannot be so powerful, for example, he specifically said the United States, that because when they do injustice in the world, it's justified, you know. So indivisibility of security basically means that everybody should have equal standing, because then when someone does something wrong, he can be held accountable. And the United States haven't had any accountability, not in Yugoslavia, not in Iraq, and not in Afghanistan. And because of their power, there was no accountability. The other part, yeah, okay, so basically he talked about instead of a unipolar world, a multipolar world. You know, and civilization states, and how everybody can work together to build a prosperous future, but as individual states. So after that, we had the 2008 recession, and then we come to Ukraine. I think I'll leave the 2020 Belarus just for now, and we'll move over to what happened in Ukraine in 2014. In 2013, Ukraine was a democratic country. The leader currently, there was, it was Poroshenko, and he was democratically elected. It was a democratic country. Yes, he was a little bit corrupt, you know, but he tried to play both sides, you know, a little bit to Russia, a little bit to the United States, and the United States orchestrated a coup in 2014, which overthrown a democratically elected president. So the values of democracy only counts when it's in favor of America. Just as one of the examples of the many that happened in Odessa, well, in Ukraine, Odessa is one city there, a port city, is there was between 48 and 100 people killed, and 220 burned, well, 220 people turned to the hospitals. A lot of people jumped to their deaths to not burn. So this has happened all over Ukraine, situations like this. It was a very violent overthrow of the democratically elected president. There was no investigation carried out, so no one was held accountable for what happened in Odessa in 2014. So what happened in Crimea didn't want to be part of this illegal government, because they are illegal. They weren't voted in democratically. There's, this major Western value. So 60% of the people in Crimea see themselves as ethnic Russians. And they decided they're going to vote for independence, and 96.77% of them voted to join Russia. Now, just to put this in perspective, one of the most important votes in British history went through with only 51%, and that was Brexit. But this vote was seen as illegitimate by the United Nations for the reason that it goes against the Ukrainian constitution. The exact same constitution that the United Nations ignored just 1 month earlier. As well as, just to bring it in, a very ironic thing as well is that Chapter 1 of the United Nations talks about the right to self-governance. And these people voted for the right of self-governance. So basically what happened after Crimea is the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic also voted for independence, and it went through with a supermajority as well. In the Lugansk area, you saw a supermajority of 96.2%, and in the Donetsk area, you saw 89.07%. So they've basically voted for overwhelming majority for independence, and according to United Nations Charter 1, the right to self-determination is important. But once again, it was denied by the United Nations. So what happened? So basically after this, Russia saw that, because Russia tried to be part of NATO, they tried to be part of the European Union, they tried to be part of this whole economic sphere, building a prosperous future, but the West didn't. Every time that Putin or Russia wanted to, grow this relationship, the West denied them. They was denied into NATO. Now NATO is this military alliance, a defensive military alliance that attacks different countries. And so basically Russia sits here and everybody is joining this military alliance, and Russia's told you can't be in this military alliance. So everybody in the room starts to be part of this alliance, and Alexander's sitting there, he's alone, and we tell him he can't be part of this alliance, and we're moving closer and closer and closer to him, moving weapons closer and closer to him, and in the end, who's there if you look at a map? Who's this alliance going against? It's against Russia. And is it a defensive military organization? No, it's not if you look at its history till this point. So Russia knew basically at this point that NATO is coming for them. And they said it openly. This is the other thing that's so ironic, is that the West openly says they want to split up Russia, they want to get hold of its resources, like they did with Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is extremely rich with natural resources, but they're extremely poor. And that's because corruption. So basically Ukraine's being exploited for the resources currently. Until February this year. So they openly talk about doing the same with Russia, and they openly talk about, destroying Russia and getting rid of Putin, but you never see the same coming from the Russian side to the West. I've been searching very long and hard to find it, and the only example I could get of this, and it's the first time, was about a week and a half ago, on one of the military channels, which Russia said they would do a preemptive strike if America sends multiple rocket launchers that would be able to reach Russian soil. This is the first example where I've got of Russia attacking first. So, the 2014 sanctions after Russia took Crimea, which basically voted for independence, the West went and they sanctioned Russia, and it had a massive impact on the Russian economy. The central bank decided to float the ruble and not defend it, and the ruble took a massive hit. The ruble is the currency of Russia. Russia basically filled up their war chest. They spent a lot on military and cybersecurity. And they created an alternative to SWIFT. They created the SPFS system, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages. The reason they did not because it would be seen as a very aggressive move. So basically they waited and waited and waited to get cut off from SWIFT by the West itself and then to implement the SPFS. They also sanction-proofed their economy and they strengthened relationship with their allies. They also tried to continue to negotiate with NATO and the West. But the thing is with liberal globalism is they don't negotiate. You know, it's basically you accept us or we destroy you, as they've done. You know, so every time Russia brings up security concerns, and they've been doing it since 2007, well, even before that, you know, NATO just ignores them, and there's no negotiation. There's no negotiation. So either you accept our terms or you're in our way, and that's basically how Russia has been seen. So after the Donetsk and Lugansk people voted for independence, they didn't join Russia, and the Ukrainian government started bombing them. Well, the illegitimate Ukrainian government started bombing those areas. According to United Nations figures from 2018 to 2021, 81.4% of civilian casualties in the Donbas war occurred in rebel-held territories as a result of Ukrainian invasion, whereas only 16.3% were in Ukrainian government-controlled territory, most being Donbas responses to a prior Ukrainian violation. This is one key reality of the war that the Western media refuses to report because it's too damned inconvenient for the Ukraine is the victim narrative being peddled by Zelensky and the US. Data from the OSCE, this is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, ceasefire monitors show the vast majority of the ceasefire violations were committed by the Ukrainian forces against the Donbas Republic. There's about 2,400 civilians that was killed in the Donbas area, and we're talking about children and women, you know, not military personnel. There were no military infrastructure near it, but the Ukrainians continued to shoot them with missiles. Now, let's talk about the military buildup before the 24th of February 2022. We've heard a lot about Russia's buildup. You know, they've been building up troops, planning to, you know, attack and completely destroy Ukraine. You know, this evil Russian empire. But it's completely the opposite. So the people that was bombing civilians in the Donbas, you know, the Ukrainian government, was the first to build up. There was between 80 and 125,000 troops that was being built up in the Donbas and preparing to attack those areas. And one of the major things is that before you invade, you bomb the enemy. Because if you bomb them, you know, they're in disarray, and when you come, you know, it's a lot easier to win the ground. And, you know, if you look at the disregard for civilian lives shown over the past 8 years, and a total disregard for the Minsk agreements ratified by the United Nations, you know, these civilians were in real danger. The ceasefire violations you're looking at here is is in 2022. You know, you can clearly see a build-up in ceasefire violations of the planning of attacking the Donbas. So yeah, just to get back off this, and this is right before the February 22nd, this was right before Putin invaded, well, not invaded, he carried out a special military operation in Ukraine. Let me just quickly check out this. This is the address that President Putin gave on the 24th of February. In context, in accordance with Article 51, Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, with permission of Russian Federation Council, and in execution of the treaties of friendship and mutual assistance with the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, ratified by the Federal Assembly on February 22, I made a decision to carry out a special military operation. So basically, the DPR and the LNR, you know, they knew this attack was coming and they asked Putin for help. The outcomes of World War II and the sacrifices of our people had to make to defeat Nazism was sacred. This does not contradict the high values of human rights and freedoms in the reality that emerged over the post-war decades. This does not mean that nations cannot enjoy the right to self-determination, which is enshrined in Article 1 of the United Nations. So even if you look at Putin's involvement in Syria, he was asked by the leader of Syria to be involved in Syria, Bashar al-Assad. Basically, yeah, the West doesn't like him either. So, yeah. But Bashir al-Assad, I don't think he's the greatest of people. So then Russia carried out a special military operation. They invaded the other parts of Ukraine, but we'll talk about that. So just to take on the military analysis of the West. Currently, Russia is the one that has time on its hands. They are not the ones running out of time. Even if you look at all the different aspects that needed to fight a war, Russia has all the times in their hands. So, considering that they actually care about their own soldiers, they're taking this very slowly and slowly wearing down by a war of attrition the enemy. And the only people that actually care about deadlines are, for example, the Americans. They want to make this huge announcement. Putin really doesn't care about, making huge announcements. I'm talking about the battle for Kiev, because we saw in the beginning that the Russians were almost surrounding Kiev, and then all of a sudden they were just gone. Now, standard military practice, if you're invading or attacking, is to have a 3-to-1 advantage. If you look at the troops that attacked Kiev, there was about 30,000 troops attacking Kiev. There was about 100,000 defenders in Kiev, and I think, I'm not sure about this, but if I remember correctly, Kiev has around a population of around 8 million. So there's no way that you can control 8 million people and win 100,000 soldiers with 30,000 soldiers. So it clearly seems that the Russians weren't planning on taking Kiev. Instead, if you actually listen to Putin's speech, he said that his main goal in this was to defend Russia's external security, with Ukraine becoming more militarized and wanting to have nuclear weapons, but as well as defending the people in the Donbass, in the LNR and DPR. That was his main goal, to defend those people. So putting troops around Kiev actually had a very strategic victory for Putin, because there was 100,000 soldiers that were stuck in Kiev that couldn't reinforce the Donbass. Now, if we look at the Russian military running out of food and fuel, if you look at the humanitarian response that Russia have had in these areas, there's about 27,000 tons, this was now 2 days ago, of food, medicines, and essentials that the Russian humanitarian response have dealt out, sorry, my English is not that well, which they have given to the people. They took heavy losses. 30,000 is when I did the presentation a few days ago. According to the Ukrainians, Russia is standing now at 30,850. Also, if you look at Russia's old equipment, because they're using old equipment, if you look at the tanks, they're using it like tanks of the 1990s and of the early 2000s. It is old equipment. Even if you look at the trucks, it's also old equipment. But if you look at the soldiers that Russia has used in Kazakhstan a few months ago, those were newer trucks, newer tanks. Even if you look at the troops that was captured, it's more these young guys. So clearly it's a sign that, if you go into a fight, you send in more the old military equipment, and you keep the rest back for in case NATO gets involved or something like that. Running out of missiles, according to the British Ministry of Defense, if I can remember correctly, Russia would have been running out of missiles about 70 days ago. So I don't think that happened. Also on the 9th of May, this was like a massive announcement. You had no planes and helicopters, but the planes and helicopters were doing practice runs on the 8th of May. So the 9th of May, the planes didn't fly because there was bad weather in Russia at that time. The Great Russian Army is not so great, corruption and no improvement. This clearly is not the case if you look at the Russian army that's involved in Syria and the Russian army that was involved in Kazakhstan a few months ago. So the other thing is we've heard a lot about the Russians shooting at civilian corridors. But who benefits from this? If we look at the history of Russia and how they've done this, for example, in Syria, they would open a civilian corridor and they would guarantee its security. They would have troops defending it and everything, and people can get out safely. And the goal of this is to get the enemy troops to slip into civilian clothes, go into the corridor, and get out. And as well, getting civilians out of those areas, which is, so it's a win getting the civilians out, it's a win getting, the opponent's troops, not fighting. So, but if you shoot at civilian corridors, what's happening? There's more civilians in the areas. The troops are like, rather I fight. If I try to go out, I'm getting killed. So rather let me fight. So then there's more troops fighting. And this has been so effective in Syria that sometimes you have a desertion rate of about 70%. So not only are you getting civilians out, but 70% of the force you're attacking is gone. So clearly, shooting at civilian corridors has the complete opposite effect on Russia. It's very negative for Russia. But it has a benefit for the Ukrainians. More specifically, not the Ukrainians itself, but the illegitimate Ukrainian government. The targeting of civilian infrastructure, if you look at, for example, at Iraq was completely leveled. When the United States go in, they bomb everything. Schools and hospitals included, but they take out the bridges, they take out the electricity network, they take out telecommunications, they bomb everything. The electricity in Kharkov and Kiev and everything has been running since the start of the war. There's been, some outages and so on, but for the most part, telecommunications and water and all those stuff is still running. So in the entire beginning of the Russian special military operation, they did not deliberately attack civilian infrastructure. It was only recently when they attacked the train stations, but the train stations was being used for military purposes, bringing weapons in from NATO and the West. So all those, it was like 2 days and the train systems in Ukraine didn't exist anymore. Also the Russian soldiers apparently have extremely low morale. I haven't seen a single video of the Russians talking to Putin and telling him, we can't fight anymore. The Russian troops are actually getting rotated. So, you're fighting for a few weeks, then you get a little bit tired, and then, you get out and fresh troops are getting in. But you're seeing the complete opposite with the Ukrainian army. Those guys don't want to fight, because they're fighting, they're not getting rotated out. There's hundreds of videos of entire, groups of people talking and telling Zelensky, we don't want to fight anymore, and then they get arrested by the military police. It's quite a rough situation. Just here, so the Russian military is struggling with poor morale. This was the Pentagon. The Russian troops are running out of food and fuel as offensive falters, says UK military intelligence. That was on the 18th of March. That's quite some time ago. The Russian army is running out of trucks for its war in Ukraine. Putin running out of missiles, jets, tanks, because they're made in Ukraine. And this other picture is the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Russian losses. I'll talk about the casualties in a moment because it's on another. So then I would like to talk about the political front. You hear that the Russian citizens is not supporting this war. But as we've seen in Crimea after Russia took Crimea, well, not took Crimea, Crimea voted for independence and then the United Nations said no, and then Russia was like, okay, we'll just go get them. You saw that Putin's approval rating actually increased. And we heard the moment that Putin, did the special military operation in Ukraine that, all the Russians are going to hate him. But even the people criticizing Putin are admitting that his approval rating is increasing. So there's even more support for Putin in Russia. The reason for this is because Putin is defending the people of the DPR and LNR. You also hear that the entire international community is against Russia. If you go look at the population, about 85% of the population of the earth lives in countries that have not implemented sanctions against Russia. It's only mostly Europe, the United States, Australia, and I think Japan. The rest of the world is not really interested in sanctioning Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, China, India. The other thing is, NATO is more unified than ever. Yeah, that's a massive lie. The infighting in NATO is currently a very interesting thing to watch. Turkey not liking it, Hungary. Well, if you look at the EU, for example, Hungary and Poland got sanctioned from this side and they got refugees in from this side. Basically what happened there is that they said the exact same thing that Putin said in 2007, is that they want their own laws to be above the Europeans' law, well, the European Union's law. But the European Union said, no, European law is above everything and you need to listen to liberal globalism. And you see that Poland and Hungary especially have more conservative, Christian types of thing, which make it very weird that they're completely on the opposite side of this war. But historical reasons is why Hungary doesn't like Russia at all. Well, the USSR, Russia is completely differently now. They're completely politically isolated, no one wants to be seen with them. The guy on the top there is Lavrov. He's the foreign minister of Russia. Very interesting guy, very smart. And all his speeches that he gives is extremely logical and reasonable. Now, when this war started, well, the special military operation, you would see that everybody ran to India because India all of a sudden gained a lot of strategic value, because it's there right next to Russia, well, China and everything, and China and Russia, they don't need to be together. And, so all the foreign ministers went to India, and you saw that Japan was willing to give a $40 billion development, to India, and Louise Mabille just said no, because it came with all these, Japan will help you, but then you need to do this, so India said no. On the bottom, you have the foreign minister of India and Truss, I think, yes, she's the foreign minister of the UK. So what happened then is, after all of these people went, all of them met the foreign minister of India. But when Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, went, he directly met with the President Modi. So clearly India is thinking this very much through. And the other thing you would see with India is, and if you look at historical examples as well, if you have two sides that you need to choose, on the one side, if you don't listen to them, they're going to give you sanctions, and you're going to face the consequences. And on the other side, hey, 30% cheaper oil, So on the one side, if you stay here, it's like, it's bad for you. If you get to this side, come to my side because you get benefits. Or, if you don't be, so this was basically what happened with India. On the one side, if they stand with Russia, or they send, and basically they did support Russia, they sent a lot of medical equipment to Russia. The Russians are also, if you look at prisoners of war, for example, or the captured Ukrainian people, Russia takes in injured Ukrainian people and they treat them in the hospitals. But the same cannot be said for Ukraine. There's hundreds of videos of Russian prisoners of war being tortured in horrendous ways and then killed. If you also look at China, China's definitely standing with Russia on this one. Saudi Arabia, a very interesting thing is because they're involved with the petrodollar and the entire thing, they're shifting. The new prince coming up now is more pro-Russia. He's a real go-getter type of guy. And he's completely, on Russia's side with this whole thing. And that's why you saw the Americans, sort of blaming 9/11 on the Saudis because they're ready to demonize Saudi Arabia. If you go against us, sorry. So Saudi Arabia actually wants to join BRICS as well. So if we look at the economic war front, SWIFT, the SBFS, Russia already had an alternative for it. 10,128 sanctions. The second country is Iran with only 3,616. So, clearly the Russian economy is going to collapse. It's complete annihilation of the Russian economy. But that's not what we're seeing. Recently, the sixth package of sanctions had a ban on they wanted to cut 90% of the imports. But who does this negatively affect? It negatively affects Europe. It actually positively affects Russia. Because the moment, if you look at Economics 101, supply and demand. The moment you ban Russian energy, you're going to need energy elsewhere. That pushes the prices up of energy. And then Russia can sell fewer energy for the same price. So it completely benefits Russia. Also, if you look at commodities, Russia has an excess of food, they have an excess of energy, and they have an excess of metals. These are their three main exports as well. And commodities in wartime is extremely important. That's the only thing that really counts. Not a fiat currency or anything like that. Commodities in wartime is extremely important. If we look at Russia's debt, because we have heard a lot about Russia's going to default on its debt. Russia is the ninth least indebted country in the world, and they have between 17 and 20% debt to GDP ratio. If you, just to put that in perspective, I think Canada is around 90% and Japan is about 220% currently. Another thing is, Russia's running out of money for their war in Ukraine. But the Russian current account surplus is actually soaring. The average account surplus every April from 2007 to 2021 was about $6.7 billion US. In April this year, the surplus is $37.6 billion. Why is this? Because energy prices have risen sharply because of sanctions. Russia has energy, food, and metals in excess. And let's talk about the ruble's recovery as well, because we've heard a lot that it's because Russia is manipulating, the markets, and that's why the ruble recovered. There's no way that a single country can support their own currency. Yes, you can manipulate the markets and increase it by 2 to 3%. All countries does that. Russia, UK, America, all of them do it. But you can't. In the end, the market decides the strength of a currency. And you've seen the ruble doing extremely well. This is the past 5 years against the euro. You can see COVID there in February of 2020. But, the ruble basically shot up. The ruble is now so strong that Putin implemented a few things to bring it back down again, because Russian commodities is actually, being unattractive in foreign markets because you have to pay so much for it. So that was a very interesting thing to see. The other thing is, Europe needs Russia more than Russia needs Europe, as my colleague stated. This is how India's oil supply is changing. This was a month ago. And, Russia's already at 10% of India's entire oil supply. So the whole Asian markets are ready for cheaper energy. Because why wouldn't you? Are you going to support an illegitimate government in Ukraine, or are you going to care for your own people and get them cheaper energy? And the moment energy goes down, it's amazing for an economy actually. And it has the exact opposite effect if energy prices go up. If the petrol price in South Africa goes up, every single thing goes up as well with it, because you have the farmer, that's going up, you need to go to the supermarket, that's going up, you need to go, so yeah, no, it's terrible. Oh, and China's also, going to fill up their strategic reserves with Russian energy. If you look at, for example, the European economy currently, they're suffering very badly. In May 2021, you've seen inflation numbers all below 5%. This is the harmonized indices I'm not going to say that word, of consumer prices, inflation in European nations. But of May 2022 this year, you see all of them above 5%. You even see as high as 20.1%. There's a lot of 8s and 7s. So yeah, inflation is a terrible thing. So the other thing is the American economy. The American economy is facing severe inflation at this point, and the only problem is the Federal Reserve in America can't raise the interest rates because America is so indebted. If you look at the early 1980s, I think it was Michael Powell. He was the Federal Reserve chairman. No, it was Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker was the Federal Reserve chairman. And basically, inflation was, really getting out of hand. And he decided to raise the interest rates all the way up to 20%. The result of this was America went into a recession, but inflation was completely cut at the knees. The only problem, and America could have done it and afforded it at that point because they had that low debt. But, and America had a lot of benefits out of it, all the bad investments sort of disappeared. But America can't do that now. They can't. They're $30 trillion in debt. So raising interest rates to the required 10 to 15% that's going to be needed to stop inflation is impossible, because only to service their debt is going to cost them $3 trillion per year. Just to service debt, not starting to pay it off. No, so raising interest rates to stop inflation is not an option, because, they can do it and then print more money to get rid, to pay it off, but that would cause more inflation. So basically they're in a catch-22 currently. Yes. So, the trade deficit in March alone was $109 billion. If you compare that to the Russian trade deficit, well, the Russians don't have a trade deficit, they have a trade surplus of $37.6 billion for the past 3 months. So the American economy isn't looking that great. And what you also see is that, and I was afraid that this would happen before our talk, is that American media and the European media are completely turning on the Ukraine situation. They admit now that the Ukrainians are facing defeat. And the other thing that's also coming to an end is the petrodollar. So we'd see from the 1970s, every time that a country stood up against the petrodollar, a few months later, the Americans invaded. They did it with a bunch of countries, and even if you look at the past 20 years as well, they've done it. But this is the first time that the entire world is starting to stand up against the petrodollar. And the petrodollar is the only thing that's giving America its strength. Basically what the petrodollar is that all the oil in the world, well, from Saudi Arabia, gets settled in dollars. So this puts the demand for the dollar up, strengthening the dollar. If everyone wants dollars, the price for dollar goes up. But Putin is the first guy that stood up against it and survived. I think, who's the other one in Syria? Bashar al-Assad also stood up for it, and Russia came to his defense because they're planning to take him out as well. You're seeing India going against the petrodollar by settling in rupee-ruble agreements. You're seeing China, also going against the petrodollar. Between Russia and China in the past 3 months, settling accounts in their own currencies is up by 1,024% with the trade between them. So they're not using dollars anymore, they're not using euros anymore. So the dollar, in the moment the demand for the dollar goes down, the value of the dollar will also go down. Now I just quickly want to talk about also that the world is facing a famine, and it's because Putin is, he's blackmailing the world, and he's going to cause a global famine. This is completely not the case. Russia wants to sell it, and Lavrov has said this multiple times. But because of European sanctions, Russian cargo ships, are banned, so they can't do it. And the other thing is, the Ukrainians mine the ports. So Turkey, a member of NATO, its foreign minister blames Ukraine for the mining, and it was Ukraine that mined the ports. So that sea is extremely dangerous now. So getting all that wheat from Ukraine and from Russia, is very difficult. And Putin said multiple times, and Lavrov as well, that they're more than willing to supply the world with food. Just lift the sanctions so that we can do it. But once again, Russia is getting, this negotiation's only one side. You didn't listen, so we're not going to listen to you. So in conclusion, I think Russia is actually sitting in a very good position currently. If you look at the military on the ground, they're making daily gains. They took in a bunch of strategic cities, Popasnaya, Liman, all those type of stuff. If you look at the political realm, Russia is clearly not isolated, and they have the entire Asian market for their commodities to sell there. If you look at the economic war, Russia has all the resources that they need to fight this war. But I think, for the Americans and for the Europeans, it's been a very strategic blunder. Europeans are facing inflation that they haven't seen in 40 years. Prices are going up. Their own people need to decide between gas and food, heating and food. That's terrible for a European country. And this is only going to get worse because they're continuing with this one-sided thing, And Russia is more than willing to, well, I don't think after the 24th of February, I don't think they're more than willing to anymore. Because it's like, we give to you energy and food, and, they're kicking the hand that feeds them. That's not very smart. So, I think for the Europeans and the Americans, it's not looking very well. So, any questions?
Taste. Okay. You can sit still.
I'll just come back here then. Okay, so I got a question or two, but first I'm just going to start with just a statement. So you mentioned the corruption in the military, in the Russian military, and how it can't be there because of how they're doing. First of all, I just want to mention that militaries can be both corrupt and effective against their opponents.
Yes.
South Africa, in Mozambique, for example, we're kicking terrorists' asses, but we know for a fact the South African military is corrupt, and it's a shadow of what it was in the past. Okay. Also, Russians have made many military blunders. For example, they've flown helicopters over no-fly zones where they've been shot down. They've lost a lot of military personnel. So Russians aren't doing well strategically in terms of just how effective they're doing. Also, there's a lot of corruption in Slavic countries that, like for example Hungary, and also apparently the Ukrainian government. There's a lot of, this is for how I understand it, so I could be wrong with this, but how I understand it, in a lot of Slavic countries, there's a lot of sort of turning the governments there into puppets from the Russian side. After this, I'd just like to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay, so just the first question was about corruption. I think definitely corruption is a problem, but it's a problem right across the world. The Russian government is definitely, there's definitely corruption, and in the military as well. But it's not, well, it is damaging them, but their military is still extremely effective. And as you mentioned, the blunders, I think if I can show it there, I'd like to show the casualties report from both sides. It's very interesting having the numbers of both sides, so I think I'll show that as well. Your second question was about puppet nations.
Yeah.
Okay, a great example would be Lukashenko. I think it's Lukashenko. What's the guy from Belarus? Yeah, Lukashenko. So basically what happened in 2020, the United States wanted to do the exact same thing in Belarus as they did in Ukraine in 2014. They wanted to overthrow Lukashenko, that's why he was there. And Putin prevented it. Yeah, there's a long story behind it and what happened and all of it. But basically Putin prevented it, and now Lukashenko is extremely loyal to Russia. There's a photo of them at the Russian Ministry of Defense a few weeks ago as well. So I think it's more this thing of, there's definitely puppet states. Let's not go around that. But it's not in the disinterest of their people. The Belarusian people would be a lot better on the Russian side than they're on the European side. The European side doesn't really, they stand for democracy, but they overthrow democratic countries, or they stand for freedom, but it's only for, the West. So I think puppet nations, that's both sides. I mean, even if you look at China, but everybody does it, so I don't know.
Yeah. There's I just wanted to make a point with what you were saying now. The thing about that Russia kind of wants to make like a multi-power
Multipolarity, yes.
Yeah, they're equally as guilty as the states as this, because Russia and China continually bully other BRICS countries by forcing certain deals on them that they just can't refuse and things like that. There's a lot of that happening. And then just my actual question.
Sorry, can you just give an example of that?
Denal recently, they're kind of, I think ultimately it'll be to the benefit of Denal, but Denal, for example, now the Russian government with Denal as their puppet, the max military weapons in South Africa, are trying to make a takeover sort of on the markets in all of Africa. And while I think it is beneficial to Denal, ultimately it's not, Denal's not free in this. They're definitely been taken by the collar. Yeah. Yeah, that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, not going to beat it around the bush. Yeah, China.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Sorry, my actual question I want to ask is, if Russia isn't using the situation as a land grab, then why don't they just occupy the new republic areas and sue for
like
peace?
Kherson.
Yeah. So
okay.
why don't they invade those areas, occupy them, and then
outside the Donetsk and Lugansk areas?
Yeah, outside of the Ukrainian center, and then just sue for peace, because that's initially I thought that's what they're trying to do, is trying to guarantee the freedom of these different republics.
Okay, so currently I see a lot of people that thinks Putin wants to take the entire Ukraine, but the way I see it, I don't think he wants to take the entire Ukraine, because Ukraine is basically divided. There's two, you have the Ukrainians themselves and then those that identify as Russian. And in the Kherson region, for example, that's outside, the DPR, LNR, but closer to Crimea, you get that those people also want to be a part of Russia. If I understand it correctly, and there's Russian passports being handled out, and people are doing transactions in ruble. So I think Putin will stop till the areas where you have Russian-speaking people. And as he said in his address in the 24th of February, that it's going to be to demilitarize Ukraine, it's going to be needed to go into the different areas. So I'm not sure till where he will go, but I don't know about that one.
So you said that Putin's support inside of Russia is up.
Yes.
What do you base that on? That's one question. And the second question is, looking at the power position that Putin has as a result of his enablement of some of the oligarchs and the strategic relationship that he has with those oligarchs, and how some of these oligarchs have now turned against him and offered sort of a bounty on his head. How do you marry those two, the support for Putin versus some of his strongest allies turning against allegedly?
Okay, so regarding your first question, pro-Putin news channels would say that Russia is, it was around 84%, 83%, and it's now, 87, 88. But more anti-Putin, news sources was it around 70, and now it's like 75, 76%. So yeah, no, I do look at both sides in this thing. Actually, I read more Ukrainian stuff than I do Russian stuff. So yeah, and regarding your second question, there's always been a thing with the oligarchs and stuff. Well, in America you'd call them entrepreneurs, but so yeah, no, the oligarchs, there's always fighting. There's always factions and stuff. You see that in every country. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on there, but there's always been oligarchs that's against Putin, or Putin goes against them, and it's infighting, standard procedure in every country. The Russians aren't saints. There's a lot of corruption going on there. There's a lot of injustice also happening there, but they do have a side, a valid side in this war. They do have very valid points in this war. So it's not like Russia, is 100% good and 100% evil. The philosophical side that Louise said. We're all human. All of us are imperfect, and that includes the Russians themselves. So I hope that answers your question, but I don't really know about the oligarchs infighting. So. Yeah.
Thank you. I would just like to add to that. Why do we assume that there's a direct correlation between the moral righteousness of a person and his right to have a perspective as to political conflict? Is it that only the good get to have a say? It's something that we don't expect in the legal system, for example. If we take that to its radical extreme, it would amount to criminals being sentenced before they put on trial. So I would say this is the political equivalent of that.
I think just two comments and then a question. Regarding puppet states, there's pretty clear evidence to suggest that the Kiev government are an American client state.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a leaked call you can find on the BBC to this day between Victoria Nuland, the State Department representative to Ukraine, and the American ambassador to Ukraine during the Euromaidan. The transcript of the call is there, and they are discussing who should be in the government and how it should be set up and who should be in opposition and what role they should play. And that was the government that resulted from the elections following the Euromaidan coup. Some of them only got Ukrainian citizenship like 2 months before the elections. It was actually quite funny. But as much as Putin has his puppet states, the idea that Ukraine is a sovereign nation in and of itself is it seems a bit naive to me. The other thing regarding, does he want the whole of Ukraine? I don't think so. If you read his speeches where they say he wants to bring the USSR back, what they're referring to is, he said the collapse of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical catastrophe. But what he didn't mean was that the loss of communism was bad. He meant that suddenly hundreds of thousands of Russians had found themselves ethnic minorities in countries they all of a sudden didn't, all of that sprang into existence overnight. And so basically he wants to reintegrate this Russian diaspora. And now my question is, to what extent is this conflict a conflict over the definition of a nation? Because Putin's very clearly operating from the old definition of a nation, that it's a common people with a common history and a common tongue. So just because Donetsk and Luhansk aren't in the borders agreed upon by the United Nations, that doesn't mean they aren't part of the Russian people. But obviously the pro-Western side is, no, we've agreed on these borders, so this is the nation, this is how it's going to be. And because you already look at it now, and it looks like the Polish are looking at the northwestern region of Ukraine, seeing if they can gobble that up. Because Ukraine is, there's an element of Lithuanians, there's Polish, and there's a Hungarian chunk around the Carpathian Mountain area. And in the east and south, there's large Russian populations. And the Hungarian prime minister has already given himself emergency powers to deploy troops quickly, which seems to me to suggest he's looking to gobble up the Hungarian portion of Ukraine. And I think it's this thing of, if you have too many nations within a nation, that nation, it can't hold together. So, just my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, so regarding the borders, I don't think it's the main battle is because of the independence and the sovereignty of nations. I think the main battle is basically between NATO, United States against Russia. You know, and the United States and NATO says it openly. You know, they're using Ukraine to weaken Russia. You know, but I mean, it's brought the Russian people closer together. You know, external conflict breeds internal solidarity. So yes, no, I think the conflict is not that much. I think it's definitely a part of it, but I don't think it's the main goal of the conflict. Een andere vraag?
Just if you want to, there is boiling water, and the urn is the other urn is filter coffee. So if you want some filter coffee, there's coffee and milk and things.
Ignatius, tell me, there's talks about chemical factories in Russia that is also American. Is there some truth on that?
Yeah, so there's a reason I didn't mention it, but the reason is not that it's untrue. So basically, you know, you've seen the CIA, you know, and the Americans basically, you know, ignoring the United Nations Charter, you know, and doing experiments on people. You know, they did it in 1980, they did it in 1984, then in 1987, and every time they get caught, and, you know, the CIA completely turned, and now they're a good, you know, organization. And every time they get caught with more and more stuff. So I think there's definitely truth to the biological warfare research in Ukraine. It's basically been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, you know. But because it's Russia saying it, you know, this evil empire, it's completely propaganda, you know. It's completely untrue. But I think definitely there's truth to it. I have here a document, if you want it, from the Embassy of the Russian Federation in the Republic of South Africa. Me and Louise visited them. I didn't change anything in my speech because of what they said. I did change one thing, and it was, I said that 95% of the people in Crimea voted for independence. It was actually 96%. That's the only thing they didn't agree on with me. But yeah, there's definitely truth to the biological warfare being, yeah, laboratories.
Sorry, just one last question. Roughly 6 months back, Putin gave a public statement saying that the age of capitalism has come to an end. So I can forward you the link to the video itself. It was on RT. So, given that, can you rule out completely that he doesn't want to revive communism and want to revive the USSR as a collective state?
Okay, so I think definitely that Putin does not want communism back. I'm not sure to what video you are referring to, but I think that the capitalism in the West, it's, if you talk about free markets and stuff like that, I mean, Russia, opened their markets to the Europeans, and, they came in and they basically, just took resources out of Russia. The other thing is, you would see in Russia's schooling system, if you want to take over a country, the schools and universities, that's where you want to be. And in the schooling system, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, it's compulsory reading in high school, and that's completely against communism. So I don't think he wants communism back. But I think, the West, they, for example, the iPhones or, the clothes, this quick fashion, all this stuff, it's being made by children in India and China, but, these capitalistic countries, they prosper on it, so it's not, I think that type of capitalism is maybe what he's speaking against, but I'm not sure about that speech. I think I'll yeah.
Okay, capitalism is not isomorphically equivalent to the notion of free markets. Putin was referring to a particular kind of ideology, which, for lack of a better term, we could call neoliberalism. And it's basically the second generation after Reagan and Thatcher upheld that everything can be settled according to the markets. The way I read Putin is that he presents us with a very distinct challenge in that he attacks globalism and the anonymous absolutization just of trade, where identity is just constituted by money. So I would suggest that capitalism's opposite here is not communism, but something like patriotism. If there's one country in the world that stands for a recovery of what we would call your older aristocratic values, it is Russia. And now, I didn't do my full speech because I wanted tonight to be about the facts rather than speculative thought. But that is, I would say, in terms of that whole Hegelian dialectic, Putin is very, very unique, almost postmodern, in that he resurrects an almost anachronistic, outdated sense of patriotism or national pride as a counterpoint to what we would call globalized prostitution, the selling of the self to the highest bidder. So I would view it in that way.
Any other questions? Yes.
How much did you receive for this talk?
Say again?
How much money did you receive for this talk?
So, they said I may not say, so unfortunately I will not disclose that information.
On a serious note, though, so you've given us a lot of stuff here. How much of this, what you've received and you've spoken, do you think is strictly true in the sense, like, there's some facts that you see from the, let's say, the mass media, or whatever you call it, side, that you're like, okay, that's true, but it's not like really true, it's out of context. How much of what you've said now do you think is in context?
Okay, so just to get back to the previous thing, I'm not getting paid for this. Not a single ruble. I am getting a yacht ride from Prem though, so no, I'm joking. No, I'm not getting paid. I think, speaking the truth is a little bit more important than money. Okay, so let's quickly go through here. This is true. Well, you can't see where my mouse is. 1999, everything that I said is true. 2001, everything I said is true. 2003, 2007 Munich speech. What I said about what he said is true. The Ukrainian coup is also, what happened in Odessa is true. The 48 to 100 people that was killed. This is true. They voted. If we can talk about the legitimacy about it, but I think if the people identify as ethnic Russians, so that's same with these two. These are true. Negotiate. Yeah, everything here is true. This is 100% true. This is true. Okay, so here's where I get into speculation. Because fog of war, all those type of stuffs. So I can't really be 100% accurate with things, but a lot of this stuff can be completely proven false. Like running out of missiles. They said it would run out of missiles 70 days ago. So wait. Okay, I mentioned that we were going to talk about the losses as well. Yeah, what I said here is true. Okay, basically with the economics, it's more of a speculation because you can't really know what's going to happen. This is true. 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 Well, according to European agencies. This is true, but I've gone into, my own opinion, about some of the stuff. But they are in a catch-22 situation. Yeah, the world is facing a famine if Russian food is not going out. So yeah, basically, what I also try to do, because I really, I'm really invested in this. So I'm really pro-Russian, to the point where. So basically, what I did is just like, yes, Ukraine, yes, Russia. So I just, went back and just, complete facts. What do I completely know? Not, what I like, and this type of stuff. Because that I can talk about for like 5-7 days at once. So yeah. Mm. I think it's a completely normal way of viewing it. I don't think it's one-sided. So, I mean, if you look at the facts, Russia is winning economically, politically. The petrodollar is coming to an end. So I think it's definitely not a biased view, in my estimation. So yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. If you have any other questions, I can send you like 10,000 sources at this point. So. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, thanks, Louise and Ignatius. I understand a lot of you had some difficulty getting here, but if there is some future philosophical event or philosophy club events, then, well, Louise is the host, so they'll just communicate. Sorry for the soundtrack in the background, but I think we got through it. So, but just thank you for everyone for being here, and thank you, Ignatius and Louise. You were amazing. Thanks. There's no time to be out, so you can hang, have coffee, and you can just leave at your own time.
So